So, Shawn, you recently did a best ball draft with Blair Andrews. You have done kind of some of the, you've had conversations with Ben on some of this over on Stealing Bananas, and you've also had a piece up last week previewing or recapping, I guess, rounds 1 through 4. But we're going to look a little bit about how the draft played out in the rounds after that. So, kind of 5 through 10 or 11, and see if there's any interesting segments that have come out in that you found unique in that particular draft. It is very early for drafting. I know our listeners will know that we kind of draft 365. We don't really stop. We just keep going. So we'll be hopefully doing one of these over the next couple of weeks. Myself and Shawn will have more of that coming your way as well. So it should be a fun one over at the FFPC. They have the way too early drafts, and I know there's many companies out there with lots of different options as well. But Shawn, this particular draft, you're going to have to refresh me here. Which spot are you picking out of?
We had the 101.
So is that allowed? Is that allowed?
It is allowed. It is.
I haven't seen that before.
Well, we selected Jonathan Taylor, so we'll see if he can do the same things for us that he did last season. But as we move kind of into the middle rounds here, and you mentioned Ben and I did a show on the first 4 rounds. I have that covered on the site. You can go check that out. The next article coming out, we'll look at these incredibly important rounds that I think people in some ways put a little bit of less emphasis on, but are actually more important. We're moving into the range now where they're no longer slam dunks. You look at the first 4 rounds, the best picks, the most controversial picks, and even the most controversial picks, it's like, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't have gone that route, but the person isn't going to lose because of that pick unless their player gets injured, which is something that's going to be difficult to know before the season starts. From here, 5 through 8, we have the first pick then in round 5. And one of the interesting things is that already at this point, the wide receivers that you really want have dried up. And I think that's the thing that really stands out to me in the early going this season, where people have talked about the wide receiver depth, and that means you can, start double running back, you can start triple running back, and then you can draft a bunch of these receivers. You can, and you could hit on some guys, and yet at the same time, you're definitely taking lesser scores and lesser upside when you're into this range already by round 5, right? And so when we talk about the number of wide receivers that you need to have in order to dominate and win the race to fill the flex, it gets a little bit iffy there. And so I think that these are some very interesting selections, and we made the decision to go with Devonte Smith. He'll be entering year 2. JJ had some cool stuff on the show earlier this week talking about his prospect model, but then also the year 2 model. I think that people can overlook that. That's one of the things that I really try and emphasize when I do the year 2 breakout projections for wide receivers, which is that it's this combination of how they performed as rookies and what their prospect grade was coming in, and we can get some real values on that. Blair has done some research with the wrong read. Anybody listening to the show knows how valuable the wrong read is, talking about just how much the target volume increases for those guys going into year 2. And that's the case even for guys who were good as rookies. I mean, we tend to think, well, part of the reason that we have this big target volume jump is that the guys who just weren't involved, I mean, obviously then if they do get involved, they're going to have this target volume jump, but there's still some real value with those other players, with the star players. And one of the things that's interesting here with Devonte Smith is that he was very involved as a rookie, right? He comes off here as the wide receiver 21, but he was already wide receiver 16 last season in terms of air yards. And you think about that, and air yards are only one part of the equation, but it is interesting to note that he was up in that range when the Eagles were not a heavy volume passing attack, right? And so we look at some of the other players who were in the same vicinity for Racer, so how well they converted the air yards. And you have guys like Terry McLaurin, who was our pick at the 4-5 turn there, our last guy in round 4. You've got some more expensive bounce back guys like Stephon Diggs, DK Metcalf. And when we think about the type of efficiency we might expect to see from someone like a Smith in year 2, you think about the way that his volume could jump. If this is a viable passing attack in 2022, I'm very confident that Smith is going to be not necessarily a home run, but is going to be a very solid pick here, especially when you consider some of the other guys going in this range. And perhaps because he's a little bit smaller, because the Eagles really did run the ball at an excruciating rate last season, there are some red flags and there are some reasons why people maybe aren't as excited about him. But I think there's a real possibility that as the offseason moves along, Smith is going to move up, similar to where we saw with the second-year rookies last year. And I should say the second-year wide receivers last year. And not all of those guys hit, but you get a feel for where those players have the chance to overperform their price, whereas a lot of the other players in this range either don't have the opportunity or you're taking a lot more risk to get there. You have someone like a Michael Thomas drafted in the middle of the round. Obviously, I mean, he's been the wide receiver one by a massive gap, and yet things have completely changed from that point. You look at someone like a Treylon Burks, as JJ was mentioning, he looks like a fantastic rookie prospect, and yet to do what a Jamar Chase did or a Jalen Waddle did is going to be a challenge. You have a little bit more risk with him there in round 5. You look at somebody at the end of the round in Amari Cooper, who, Jerry Jones was talking about in the playoff game, he's got to be better. And I'm thinking to myself, you have to do better internal evaluation if you're the Cowboys and understand that it's not Amari Cooper that needs to do better. You got to throw more passes to CeeDee Lamb, right? So we have some situations here where on the one hand, we like Smith better in part because he went earlier. He was the first pick in round 5 as opposed to the last. But I like his upside compared to other wide receivers in this range.
Yeah, and I agree. And when we look through just for the ADP for the listeners, you mentioned Smith going at the 501, but there is a lot of running backs going in this area. And of course, this is into that area of the running back dead zone. So like, Ezekiel Elliott's going in that range, but you mentioned some of the other guys that are around that. And they are guys who they will have potentially big weeks, but they're almost like players that are potentially kind of bounce back candidates. Now, Tyler Lockett had a solid season, but you have Michael Thomas in there, you have Amari Cooper. Then we're getting into the younger guys, but we have Mike Williams, who probably peaked out at what we can expect based on how his season went versus the rest of his career. We have Hunter Renfrow, who's in there, who's a solid option, but the ceiling is probably going to be capped there. But going into third-year players like Darnell Mooney, then we're into Marquise Brown. There is some rookies mixed in there, but then you're already in round 6, you're starting to see the likes of Gabriel Davis, who had a massive playoff game, but based on where he was going last year and where the season went up under that playoff game, it's an interesting spot. You have Robert Woods come back off injury, Adam Thielen, who is banged up. You have Christian Kirk then when we get into round 8. So we're starting to look at a lot of players in that range, and there is a lot of running backs going in this round, this round range, I guess we'll say, in that dead zone. We have Leonard Fournette in round 5, and then even our favorites last year, Sean, who looked like they were potential values in like a James Conner, who was going in round 10, now going in round 8 in terms of this particular draft. Tony Pollard going in round 9. So some of those guys going in similar ranges. But then we do have the likes of Penny, who was one of our kind of late season saviors, going in round 8. So there's a lot of interesting moves there to running back position, and it looks like we will be trying to target wide receivers. But like you mentioned, wide receiver drying up pretty early, and I think you've done a really solid job here in terms of what you've been able to get. So Devonte Smith in round 5, and I think he feels like somebody who is going to climb this offseason. And the situation last year, although the Eagles did win some games, probably as a wide receiver couldn't have been much more volatile. We even seen it with like Dallas Goedert and how his usage could kind of differ from week to week. So I think there's a lot of potential for growth in that Eagles offense. And then Brandon Ayuk in the 6th round, who was in this range last year, but then obviously didn't have a great start to the season. Season couldn't have probably started any worse for him. The season started or finished very, very well. And again, we're going to look at what happens in the offseason. If we get Trey Lance in there, people might think, well, maybe that's not overly, and from a passing perspective, that much better than Jimmy Garoppolo. But I still think the upside of having Lance in there against defenses and having Ayuk and Samuel and Kittle in there, I think Ayuk's in a good spot there. You get Kyler Murray then, which, we talked with JJ earlier this week. We didn't really get into the very, kind of the stud quarterbacks, but we are going to see in best ball leagues quarterbacks go in that kind of round 5 through 8 range. Some of the other guys go in there, Lamar Jackson in the 5th, Justin Herbert in the 6th, and then we have Rodgers, Burrow, and Prescott going in the 7th. And then again, Sean, you're back on the train this year. One of our favorite guys. I don't think we'll ever give him up, and he got us over the line in the big final to get to 2nd spot. Last year that is Noah Fant, and then Pat Fairmouth, who I don't know anyone that was as positive of Fairmouth after the draft and finishing up with the Steelers with his draft selection as you last year post draft for those rookie drafts in Dynasty. And because of that, I have him in pretty much every league that I drafted, or we did rookie drafts last year, and then 2 of the rookies, and Garrett Wilson and Drake London. And again, the work that I've touched on a couple of times on the show that Curtis Patrick has done, and there's been a lot of work on the site over the last couple of years as the rookies pre-draft, pre-NFL draft, and how much that changes post-draft. So, we could see those guys take a 2 or 3 round jump after the NFL draft, depending on that landing spot that they find themselves in. So I think based on how the rest of these teams have selected and how things have played out, I think you've done a really solid job there from round 5 through 11. And of course, something that was interesting that JJ mentioned as well was his drafting being based on the structural drafting kind of that we would do similarly as well. And I think this draft structure, I think, is going to be interesting as you continue to play it out in your articles to see how it plays out, because there's a lot of dead zone running backs in here, and I'm interested to see as well. You've only given me the snippet here of these rounds on the draft board. I would be interested to see how those structures have played out as well. Looking back in those rounds, Shawn, is there anything that you would do differently? Was there any players that you missed out on that were very close to falling your way that you were hoping to get that just missed out and then had to make an alternative selection?
Yeah, well, one of the things that we wanted to see kind of in that round 5-6 range is where would Breece Hall go? Where would Travis Etienne go? Those are really our targets. And Hall goes at the 506. I think that he's the best value in that round. Etienne goes at the 609. I think that he's the best value in that round. Those are players that, unless we get pretty negative information back as the offseason goes along, and that's always possible, and that's factored into where they're priced right now. If Hall ends up in a situation maybe similar to Javonte Williams last year, where he's either in a committee or perhaps not even the clear starter. I mean, he looks like the top back in this draft with Isaiah Spiller and Kenneth Walker also being in the mix. Spiller, somebody I like, and is often mocked as the top back. Those guys, if they have a role, they're going to climb into that 3rd round range, you would think, as the offseason goes along. If the Jaguars seem to have sort of any semblance of competency and we get good injury information back on Etienne, he's going to move into that 3-4 round range. I mean, you're getting a multi-round discount here unless the news ends up being very, very poor. And when we're trying to figure out, like, how can we build running back upside into our teams without paying the exorbitant prices that the real stars often go for, then I think you have to take some shots in this range. You mentioned Ayuk. He's an interesting guy here where, he averages 15 points per game as a rookie. He looks like someone who could potentially take the next step and be a real star. Obviously, he falls apart over the first half of his sophomore campaign, then he rallies to average over 13.5 points from week 9 on. He's really the perfect weapon for the modern game, right? And you alluded to some of that. He averaged 6.2 yards after the catch per reception, which was 8th best in the NFL. We know the 49ers, one of the things that they really like to do is deploy these guys in a way where they can gain yards after the catch. And the fact that they have multiple weapons who do that with Ayuk and Deebo Samuel, who they've said they're going to continue to use as a running back, which there's the possibility there that opens up more targets for Ayuk. Obviously, George Kittle, one of the very best overall tight ends. So they have some weapons there. But one of the things that you see, even in this bad season from Ayuk, is the dominated intermediate targets. He was unstoppable over the middle of the field. You can go to his Player Explorer page and see the chart that kind of illuminates that a little bit. I'll have that in the article. But those are some things that we really like to see from big-time wide receivers, players who could take the next step and be absolute stars. Do I think that that's going to happen in Trey Lance's first season? I guess I still have some concerns, and I wouldn't, go out and say, look, I mean, this is an absolute smash. He's going to be a player who scores 19 points a game and is going to be drafted in the 2nd round next season. I have more conservative hopes than that, but I do think he's someone who could outperform ADP. And one of the things that we talk about a lot is that you want to go after talent here, right? And kind of let the game play out. If Trey Lance ends up being better than, some of the rookie practice reports indicated, a little bit of the flashes that we saw in the games, then, I mean, there's a dream scenario here where you've got an absolute star. And, part of this is just going to be good PR from the team and trying to help people understand the direction that they're going in and smooth the way for this trade of Jimmy Garoppolo. But the 49ers would have you believe that Trey Lance took a big step over the last month of the season in terms of how he looked in practice, accuracy, understanding the offensive concepts, that type of thing. Again, I would consider that to be mostly good marketing, but we have to hope that he can come out and run the offense in a very effective way next season.
You mentioned good marketing. He obviously just wasn't good enough, though, with Jimmy Garoppolo's bad shoulder and kind of dislocated thumb to actually play in the offense. That's obviously, he was doing very, very well, but just not well enough to overcome that. So we'll see what happens next year. I still have high hopes for Lance. And, I think a lot of the things we talked about last year, it's always interesting to hear that, though, because we do hear, similar things with Jordan Love, and both of those guys could be complete and other washouts and, busts, but, let's hope that there's some positive there, and we'll see both of those guys have success. Did you enjoy that clip? Make sure you hit that subscribe button to get more content from RotoViz. And of course, you can check out full-length podcasts at rotoviz.com/podcast. Available on all podcast platforms. Check out our wide range of content. Once again, rotoviz.com/podcast.